Welcome to the session that I may be most excited about. All of the sessions are exciting, of course, but this one I'm particularly excited about. This is where we, I think, come to grips with some of the real doing of the work we've talked about at the conference. How do you set up a behavioral insights team and make it succeed across the kind of diversity of sectors that we're going to talk about today? They have various levels of governments and topics. I'm incredibly passionate about this as being an area of focus and interest for me for a long time. It's actually what I wrote my master's thesis on and have continued to think and concentrate on a lot ever since. By way of introduction, I'm Julia Featherston, and I lead BSmart, which is the Boston Consulting Group's behavioral economics and behavioral insights work. And so I work both with our clients to help them think about how they either establish a behavioral insights capability in their organization, how they might upgrade it, and then we also do quite a lot of work on ourselves inside the organization to think about how we can be more effective in the ways that we work, how we make people happier and more fulfilled in the work that they do. So our kind of goal in the time that we have together today is to actually start to peel back the curtain a bit and share a little bit about how the behavioral sausage gets made, as it were, but also to showcase a little bit the diversity and similarities of the lessons from around the world from some of our practitioners who've established and then truly begun to operate these behavioral insights teams. And then I hope from the audience a bit of shared reflection and learning as well about how we carry some of that forward. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to invite each of them to share a little bit about their journey in their jurisdiction, and then we'll bring them all back on stage for a conversation. Just to foreshadow a little bit of what I think you can expect to see over the coming 90 minutes, I'd anticipate that we're going to see a couple of themes come out as really, really important across the various boundaries of our different speakers. And one is that importance of leadership, support, and sponsorship. So the kind of from the overarching governance of the organization, no matter what sector it's in, how you actually build that support early on and then continue to sustain it and engage the organizational leadership. The second part is about getting really clear on the operating model of the organization. You're going to see a real diversity of operating models showcased this morning, but being really specific about what business you're in, the ways in which you work with your partners, with other organizations, with other stakeholders is also really important. And then thirdly and finally, this question that we don't always devote much time to, but getting the internal rhythms right, the less glamorous but critically important pieces of how you actually build the capabilities of the team, how you create professional development career tracks for people inside the team, how you bring in the right capabilities at the right time, how you establish and then sustain the processes of the teams. So that's what we're going to do together in the time that we have. There'll be lots of space for you to ask questions and to continue the conversation. But by way of introduction, I'm going to introduce all four of our speakers and then invite the first of them, Tara Oliver, to join me here on stage. So Tara by now should be no stranger to any of you. She's the Managing Director of the Behavioural Economics team of the Australian Government, BETA, and our host for this conference over the last 2 days. Inside BETA, as many of you may already know, she leads a really diverse team of behavioural scientists, economists, and policy practitioners. Before she took on this role, Tara had held a variety of senior leadership roles across the Australian government on topics like water policy, regulatory reform, fiscal policy, and has worked really closely at the intersection of Commonwealth and state relations as well. Following Tara, we're going to hear from Dr. Alex King, who directs the Behavioural Insights team in the New South Wales Government and the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and has headed it up since 2015 when that team took on a really expanded size and scope, which I think is a journey that he is going to talk about. Previously, Alex worked for both the New South Wales and the UK governments in planning and performance strategy development. The New South Wales team, as I'm sure he's going to share with you this morning, actually working on a myriad of issues simultaneously, as varied as kind of school attendance, domestic violence, thinking about how you actually promote the uptake of government services that already exist but are not widely used. Alex, for those of you who did not know, and as I only just learned, has a PhD in astrophysics, so I might also share a little of his own non-linear journey towards leading the Behavioural Insights team. Third, we're going to hear from Will Mailer, who leads the Behavioural Economics team at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which is a multidisciplinary unit that works across the bank's product lines or business lines to think about how you improve the financial well-being of customers and communities. So beginning to continue that conversation that we had in the plenary session this morning, and it's nice to see both Mohammed and Michael in the room as well. Before he joined CBA, Will actually established and then led the PwC Behavioural Economics team, which is an international network of across PwC's various practice groups that provide specialist advice across a range of the industries that PwC serves, including retail, health, financial services, and the government sector. And then fourth, we're joined by Dr. Mariam Chammat, who is the executive advisor at the French Behavioural Insights Unit, Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation, or DITP. Mariam works in that unit in translating findings and methods from the cognitive and behavioural sciences to work on strengthening evidence-based policymaking and piloting projects, particularly between policymakers and researchers. And Dr. Chammat's work her PhD is in affective and cognitive neuroscience, where she works on various ways in which emotions can bias perception. We're lucky to have them all here. I think we're lucky to have such a diverse range of voices. And so with that, we'll kick off and take each of our practitioners in sequence, but I'll ask you to start by joining me in welcoming Tara to the stage.
Great. I suffer severely from optimism bias, particularly when it comes to delivering presentations. So I'll probably start off with a couple of extra stories and more context and speed up right at the end. I apologize in advance. Most people are suffering from optimism bias when it comes to things like we heard about in the last session, so paying off credit cards and everything like that. So it probably goes a little bit to why I was so excited to come across and help make the first behavioural economics team in the Australian government a reality. When it was put forward to me is have had an economics training and I'm severely in what I do. So it resonates greatly and deeply with me. So just to start off, I'm going to tell you about a few things, but I want to frame it up in terms of thinking about putting together a great Broadway production. For a great Broadway production, you really need some really critical elements. So you need really great sponsors and investors to believe in your idea. You need, for example, a really creative, talented director that brings incredible street cred, and that's not me, that's Michael Hiscox at the back. You need a producer who then kind of works side by side with the director to make things happen, to navigate the system, and to start delivering projects. A great stage, we're based in the Prime Minister's department, and we have really incredible backing from the Prime Minister. You might have seen that he signed off on the forward of the showcase document that you've got in your delegate bags at this conference. And incredible support also from Martin Parkinson, who you heard from yesterday, and David Gruen today in our financial wellbeing session. You also need incredible actors that complement each other on the stage. And so I'm going to get to that part as well. So like any good Broadway production, you might have to start off quite small and iterate and evolve. So I like to think that we kind of started in community theatre, for example, in our first phase. And we've had very discrete acts. We've always had a very clear plot and storyline, and there have been a couple of plot twists. So just to give you that framing, I'll cover all of these things shortly. So we have always had a really strong mission right from the outset, and that was to apply behavioural economics rigorously to the application of design and testing for policies and programs. And we've really relied on 4 key pillars in doing that as well. We build APS capability. That's a really strong part of the mission for us. It's really about making behavioural insights more of a norm, not a novelty, not only the exclusive domain of behavioural insights teams. Citizens are our business. Behaviour change is our business. So it really is the case from Beta's perspective that everyone operating in policy needs to be thinking about this. And of course, when you're working in a company and thinking about products for your clients. We also design interventions and roll out randomized control trials, as you would have heard from Michael earlier. This is our really fun part of our business, and it also goes to capability because we work hand in hand with our partners, and there's a lot of capability transfer when we do deliver our projects. We do provide advice. This is a smaller part of our business, but we are sitting within the Prime Minister's department. And we do have the ear of someone incredibly influential when it comes to designing big picture policies. So we will provide advice directly to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. We are very targeted when we do in fact do that. And of course, testing and building evidence, and it goes to our guiding principles. I think we've set really clear and strong standards that we pre-register, pre-announce essentially on our website all of our randomized control trials. And we publish all of our results by default, whether what we've tested works or doesn't work. And we've certainly done both of those things. So we've delivered some incredible projects, and I might give you a tiny taste if Caitlin gives me time later. We've also put out reports on things that didn't work as we expected, and that's really triggered really great debates and conversations in the team about what do we do with this and how do we think about it and how would we talk to a minister about it and how do we frame it in our reports. And that's really helped us grow as a team. So the pre-commitment to pre-register, I like to think of as a bit of a pre-commitment device on ourselves. And in talking to Cass Sunstein yesterday about choice architecture for choice architects, it's a pre-commitment tool. So we've told the world that we're operating in a particular space, we're investigating it, and that really keeps the pressure on us to have to come back and release the results of those projects. So this is our service offering at Beta. These are the amazing actors that I talked about. So we started off with around 3 people, Michael Hiscox, myself, another very committed individual. And within 18 months, we'd done well enough and we'd launched an amazing set of trials. And we had the belief of our senior leaders that they invested in us for a further 3 years. And we were able to receive central funding, which was really great. We were then able to expand our team. We've gone from 3 people to over 30 people. And this is the wonderful team that has pulled this conference together. And they're really amazing. You'll see Michael Hiscox here as my co-pilot in what I call the first phase. And also we've been working with Bob Sloanham over the last year. So these are the kinds of domain expertise and sectoral expertise we have in our team. We've deliberately gone and recruited people straight from academia into the Australian Public Service in our team. Consultants, we've got people from econ, psych, neuroscience, anthropology, communications, and we've teamed them up with battle-hardened people who know how to navigate the system and how you talk to senior leaders in the Australian Public Service. So this is what I call the Backstage Crew. It's actually really important. So our structure, because it's not really quite a reality yet, we want to make it one, to be able to go out and find somebody in the market who ticks every capability box you need to design a behaviourally informed intervention, to then design a randomised control trial, to rigorously analyse that, to line up all of the ducks in government to make that happen, and then make sure it gets scaled or translated into policy. So what we've done is we've implemented a matrix structure at BETA, which brings out, for any given project, we bring people from our behavioural science team with our trial design team and our policy and project managers. We also have a bespoke methodology, which is rather like a lot of other behavioural insights teams. And I won't go into all of the Backstage Crew too much, except to say when you are starting a startup, these details really matter. And you need to kind of have the infrastructure in place to do things like ethics, to run trials, so that you can induct people really quickly and they understand the business and they know how to operate the system. So I alluded to great partners and investors. And so we started in 2016, and we started, this is a story I really love, was that secretaries across a lot of departments in the Australian Public Service had seen the work of other behavioural insights teams, particularly in the UK and in the US, but also they'd heard New South Wales had gotten ahead of us, right? And there's nothing better in a federal system of government for the feds to find out that we're trailing behind. And so they all came together and they all said, this is great, we believe in behavioural insights, we need to do more of this, and in fact, we all going to give you some money. So they became our investors, and we then worked with each of our clients. By the first 18 months, we had 18 government departments funding us, which, to give you an idea, I believe there's about 21 departments. So practically the whole government. Since then, when we secured funding 18 months later, we've secured central and stable funding, which is really great for 3 years. But we've also retained an element of our contribution model. And we see that this is quite a differentiating feature for us compared to some other teams you'll hear about. And we felt that that had worked quite well in the first phase. Running rigorous randomized control trials are exciting. They can also be really challenging sometimes, and there's inadvertent twists and turns. And so having a contribution, whether it's being $50,000 or $80,000, it just keeps people at the table. Keeps people at the table saying, we've invested, we want to make this happen, we want to make this a reality, and you're all in that together. So a few key acts which I've alluded to, moving from our wholly partner-funded model through to where we are now. We really were focused on starting up and winning hearts and minds in the first phase, raising awareness, launching a whole stack of really great randomized control trials. In this second phase, we're really deepening our capability and our expertise, and we're still launching really great trials. And Act 3, I think now that we've got some really great wins and solutions that have been rigorously tested and trialled, we want to start turning our effort and our thinking into how do we get government to start scaling some of these tried and tested interventions, because that's when we'll have a really amplified impact of behavioural insights. So I won't go into that. That's just a very quick snapshot of some of our achievements. We've trained way more than 1,200 people across the public service. We've tested our designs with tens of thousands of real people, which I'm really proud of. And we are starting to deliver financial returns to government, and that was quite persuasive in getting our central funding, where we did talk about a return on investment and the efficiencies that can arise from investing in behavioural insights, but also in terms of just the outcomes for Australians. Many of our results are showing benefits and outcomes that are far greater than looking at what sort of saving are we returning to the budget. So antimicrobial resistance, if you haven't seen this yet, Michael talked about this in the health session yesterday, and it's in your showcase document. So have a look. Our best performing letter reduced antibiotic prescriptions by 12.3% over 6 months, and that is really, really huge. We also worked with human services, so have a look at that. This is a smaller scale trial, but really important in terms of saving people's time and peace of mind, and allowing them to get on with their lives and not have to make contact with the Department of Human Services because they've forgotten to do a small compliance part of being in the program and receiving the income that they need. So challenges and opportunities, I might leave it there because I've run out of time. But I did want to say innovation is happening. There is a lot of support for us in government. And there is sometimes resistance, but we're working really hard, and I've been really impressed with the level of support. Overcoming our own biases, I mentioned this with Cass Sunstein yesterday, and I think if it's perhaps on right now, Nudging the Nudges is all about how do we overcome our own biases. And if you're not able to attend that session, then please do watch the video. All of our sessions are being videoed and are going to be uploaded for all of you to see quite soon. Thank you.
Oh, no, okay. Locked off that. Well, good morning, everybody. Just a bit of a break with tradition. I'm not actually going to use any slides today, which I know worried a lot of the conference organisers on multiple occasions. Forces you to turn your attention to hopefully what I'm saying rather than what's on the screen. I'd like to claim it's increasing the salience of my words. It's probably more to do with laziness on my part or some planning or planning fallacies on my own part there. Look, I mean, I think Tara's set out some very interesting themes about setting up a BI team of any kind, and I'm sure it'll be repeated to some extent by both what I say and what my other speakers say today. I guess there are some sort of similarities and some subtle variations. Certainly in New South Wales, our journey began with sponsorship, as indeed I think that's always the first point of call into setting up any team is who is fundamentally going to authorise this thing to come into being. In the UK, it was sort of an alliance between a very senior advisor to David Cameron, who managed to get the then Prime Minister interested in the topic, but also the head of the Cabinet Office, the Cabinet Office Secretary, head of the Cabinet Office, and those two individuals in a sort of partnership were able to really engage enough of the senior decision makers in government, but really at a very central level, really beginning that very much just starting with the PM and a few central advisors and building out from there. And in New South Wales, we actually followed, coincidentally, really a very similar model. One or two of our senior advisors to the Premier and the head of our Department for Premier and Cabinet, Chris Eccles, who now heads up the Victorian team and has set up another team there, again formed a little bit of alliance to having picked up the success of the UK team and were very interested in that. So at the end of 2012, they decided to get together and set up a small team again without trying to go really wide and broad. So that started off with quite a narrow sponsorship model, sort of one or two kind of key decision makers saying, we're just going to start it, we're going to make it happen. We're going to do it now, and we're going to do it here. And then we're going to try and build interest and enthusiasm from there. I think it's interesting to look at other teams, and I think BITA took a different model in the sense of trying to build a slightly wider alliance before initiating. Ours took more of that model of just get it going here, and then everyone will start to love it as soon as you show them what you're doing. That's the theory behind that anyway. So having agreed to set up, and we very much followed the UK's lead and very much followed the UK's model. We actually originally contracted with the Behavioural Insights team in the UK to second initially one, then two staff members over to set it up and get things going here. But that, I think, does raise the second question which I wanted to touch on, which is, who are you, or what are you going to be, or what model are you going to follow? Because there are different variations on this theme. There are many things. What is a BI team? A BI team can do many things, and you have to be, I think, clear from the outset where you want to play in this space. So, are you in the business of taking insights from behavioural sciences and designing changes and that could be to public services, it can be to public policies, or it can be to often to regulations from public policy. Is that your primary goal, or are you more of an advisory model? So Tara mentioned this, and again, our team similarly has people come to you with problems and you try to solve them. Are you more about building a behavioural insights capability across the public service? Is that your fundamental raison d'etre? The idea is distributed, everyone can do it, you're just there to kind of enable that. Or And to what extent, if you are designing interventions, do you also get into that evaluation side of things? Randomized controlled trials has been a big theme of what we do, what BD does, a lot of BI teams do. But that is partly, there's good reasons for that, but it's not an inherent part of the model. You could try to imply a BI team without that. I wouldn't recommend it for a number of reasons, which we could go into, but you could try and put it as a part. So where do you want to be in that sense? Now, with our team, we followed the UK's model in the sense of probably 80% of our time was focused on designing behavioural interventions and then testing them using randomized controlled trials, or sometimes it's slightly more inferior methods of evaluation. We also did some work on capability building and awareness raising and some on advice, but really about 80% of our time was focused on that trial, and that's not necessarily the case for every team, and I think hopefully some of the teams will talk about some slightly different models for that. You also have to think a bit about, are you going to try and centralize or decentralize? Do you try and set up a small team, or in some cases a big team? Tara talked about going up to 30 people. Not many teams that get up to that size. Or are you trying to get BI teams in every agency in government or every branch of your organization? Or are you trying to distribute your expertise across the whole organization? I think the ATO, for example, started out with a very interesting model where really they had people who just embedded everywhere, and there was for a long time no real central team, and then they sort of set up a central coordinating team to help with that, but it's still quite small relative to the number of people who are sort of out in the business rather than together. And again, there's no right answer to that one. There are pros and cons in both models. Embedding people out in the business helps you spot opportunities and really embed it in frontline service deliveries, but on the other hand, you don't always get that critical mass that you might get bringing people together. The next thing to think about is about links to other areas of government, and in particular, who else is, Behavioural Insights in my mind brings together concepts like innovation, evaluation, data, and there are sometimes other people in government trying to do those same things, right? Do you have an evaluation team already, an innovation team, a data team? Now, in our case, we didn't have any of those things really, not centrally, so we were really trying to offer a cradle to grave or a fork to field, to use an agricultural analogy, service, really the whole thing, whereas different teams, again, have taken different paths depending on who else is already there. So in Victoria, for example, they had an existing innovation function within their DPC, so they had to think about how they fit within that. So rather than doing a standalone service, it was more of an extension service. The team is a critical part of this. Tara talked about this, and I absolutely endorse that. Who you have, can make or break this. Enthusiasm, probably, I would say, the single most important characteristic there, followed very rapidly after that by expertise. And I put them in that order because I think expertise without enthusiasm is nice to have expertise, but without that real burning passion to make change, to drive value, to get new things happen, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. You have to think a bit about depending on the model you've chosen, what specialism do you need? Now, BI, of all the areas I've worked in government, has probably the highest level of needing depth of knowledge, and not just in one discipline, but in many disciplines. It makes it pretty tricky. So how are you going to bring together the right people with trial design experience, with behavioral science knowledge, but also sociology, economics, psychology, anthropology? How do you bring that all together with a strong core of people who just understand how to make stuff happen in government? Again, Tara mentioned this. That's probably the single most critical skill set, but without that pairing with the expertise in terms of the behavioral sciences, you're never going to go anywhere. You're just a generic innovation team. And again, there are different ways of accessing that expertise. So we originally did that under contract through the Behavioural Insights team. Other teams have done that through partnerships with academia or sometimes poaching academics. Michael at the back there. But you have to think about how you're going to bring that in, how you're going to hold it in-house, and then how are you going to retain that? Because one of the big challenges I think most BI teams over time is a lot of expertise to bring together, and people move on, especially in government. We have fairly short periods of tenure. People stay for a year or two, and then they're gone again, and you've taken them a year to train them up in the first place, right? So that can be quite challenging to deal with. And how do you specialize or generalize them? We started off with quite a small entrepreneurial model, 4 or 5 people. Everyone sort of did everything, the whole service themselves. As you get bigger, you have the option of kind of trying to specialize a bit more, and we've moved down a little bit in that path with some more sort of specialist data analytic capability and trial design capability. Media, I think, is something we faced here in New South Wales, which perhaps has become a less of an issue over time. When the UK team set up, there was a lot of negative media about, well, basically 2 types of story. One was, it's all a waste of time, it's not going to work, and the other was, it's evil and manipulative and Orwellian and Machiavellian, and I can't believe government's even considering doing anything in this space, you evil swine. Now, we had actually very similar 2 sets of headlines in New South Wales. it doesn't actually tend to last for long, about 12 months long, about long enough that you start publishing the first results, and they go, oh, well, that's just common sense. That seems very sensible, really. I can't believe we didn't do that before. And obviously it works. It's brilliant. Government, very innovative, fantastic. So, but it is sometimes that initial storm. And I think every team saw that in the initial years, and then over time that started to die off as BI has gained more traction internationally. But it is something to watch out for if you're moving down this path, is there is that risk. We then moved into building primary demand. And again, this perhaps become a bit less of a problem over time as more internationally the recognition of BI has gone up. But we had to initially do quite a lot of just telling people what the hell BI was, how it could help them. Often did this under the banner of a community of practice or training, but often a lot of it was really just awareness raising, getting out there, really being seen, being visible, telling people, selling the story. Then moving into sort of quick win territory, you're looking then at getting on the ground, getting some results, getting some runs on the board fast. We did things like taxes and fines and appointments and replication of trials that have done elsewhere, just to quickly build up and show it really can work here. You then want to go and really use that to engage your champions, get stakeholder enthusiasm up, get people really interested and excited, and then they want to come back to you with the next round, the bigger. You solved that small challenge, now about this big one, can you tackle that one? And that's really been our journey, is away from the kind of small, simple, quick win stuff, relatively simple, it's still complex, taxes and fines and appointments, into things like solving domestic violence, or helping to solve domestic violence, childhood obesity, ongoing behaviors like apprenticeships takes 4 years to complete. How do you keep someone on track for the whole period of time? That really pushes the boundaries of what BI can do, but I think that's the interesting next generation. And helping your masters fundamentally solve their problems. So most of us, people who work in government, we report to democratically elected officials. They find out what do they care about and help them solve those, and that gives you the license to operate in other areas. And then going beyond that into thinking, well, we can do this, but how do we then, the next generation for us will be about how do we really embed this at scale across the whole public service? We've done many interesting things, and there's lots of reports on our website you can look at if you're interested. And we've moved into some complex behaviors, but we're still only touching a fraction of what BI can do in theory. So the next part of our journey for us is going to be around how do we then move from being a very interesting and successful but fairly small part of government into how do we get it into everyday practice in government? And that's not a challenge I think we have an answer for yet, but it's an interesting one we could discuss. Thank you.
On a Friday afternoon in March, the CEO of a major US airline sent a memo to 90,000 of his staff. The memo read that a $300 quarterly staff bonus was to be replaced by a lottery where a much smaller number of staff could win $100,000 or a new car or a new holiday. This was to build excitement and engagement. 72 hours later, after what was described as a social media firestorm, the CEO issued a new memo. I wanted to title this talk today, Build It Fast and Slow. How do you build a corporate behavioural insights team carefully and with rigour and safely? I think it's great to see so many corporates starting to enter this space to create new types of behavioural innovation and partner with researchers and produce great research. But when we move too quickly, bad things can happen. Things that might have made a lot of sense intuitively or seemed like great ideas with the insights can go wrong and backfire and cause harm. Things that are counterintuitive and perhaps didn't make as much sense, but which are really, really effective, can be missed. And behavioural insights may be applied inconsistently across your organisation, even in ways that run against the value and vision of your team. So today I wanted to talk about building it fast and slow. So what about these great examples around the world? There are organisations doing this really, really well, partnering with academics, partnering with community groups, building fast and slow, creating great research and great behavioural innovation. Why don't we just copy them? And we thought about this when we sat down in the CBA team. But unfortunately, there's no template for this. There's no shortcuts. I think every team needs to sit down, look at their own vision, their own constraints, and their own operating environment, and answer some really tough questions. And that's exactly what we did. We spent a lot of time going through this. And unfortunately, as I said, I can't provide a template today, but what I thought I would do is start to build up more of a conceptual framework that helps you to think through some of the questions that we faced as we built the behavioural insights team at CBA. And hopefully that will then help others in the room to think through their context and how they want to build. Perhaps unsurprisingly, start with the vision and overinvest here, because this is going to guide a lot of subsequent decisions. What do you want your team to be known for? What do you want your team not to be known for? What are the big problem spaces that you want to solve? What is the level of ambition? Do you want to optimize existing operations and products, or do you want to change the game? Do you want to create whole new behavioural innovations and new ways of working? CBA, fortunately, was launched, the CBA team was launched at a time when the bank was launching their new approach to financial wellbeing. So our timing was very fortunate. You heard a little bit about that in this morning's session with Mo and Mike. And we had top-down support. So we had the room and the time and the support to build very carefully and to think through decisions and make a lot of tough calls. So the vision of the bank in the new approach to financial wellbeing was to improve the financial wellbeing of customers and communities. So we cascaded from there. What are the problem spaces we want to solve under that vision? We came up with a number of strategic priorities to improve the financial decision-making of Australians, to address social impact barriers, and to build trust and transparency in banking. We also had to make a lot of tough calls under that vision as to what we weren't going to do, and I think that's very important as well. I think this has been touched on by our previous speakers as well. Do you want your team to operate in a domain-specific way, or do you want to run across domains? Are you building a behavioural marketing team or a behavioural risk team or otherwise, or do you want your team more centralised to be able to operate across your organisations? And I think this will also have a lot to do with where your team will then sit. Will it sit within the HR department, the marketing department, or perhaps a more centralised strategy department? This will also dictate the type of talent you're going to need. Are you recruiting HR specialists and training them into behavioural insights? Or are you recruiting behavioural technical specialists and then training them into domains across your organisation? And I think that's a really important early decision that you're going to have to make. And as it was suggested before, those first few staff you bring on board are going to be very critical to the success of your organisation. Then the horizontal axis. Do you want to consume insights? Do you want to take what's already been found out about behavioural insights and apply it directly to your organisation? Or do you want to partner with researchers? Take it slower, work out what works and why, and build up an evidence base within your organisation and challenge status quo and really try to develop new insights as well as consuming old insights. Based on that, we'll need to work out what type of partners we need to work with. You may want to build an academic panel. So if you're going to produce insights, understand the limitations of your internal team and go out and try to partner with researchers that are interested in the same areas that you're interested in. Also, you may want to build a practitioner panel, depending on the demand your team is receiving. You may want to work with other consultancies, but I would stress to be careful in the types of partners and academics you want to work with. Make sure they're consistent with the vision and values of your organisation, your team, and the type of research that you want to do to make that really work well. Clearly, risk and speed, there is certainly a trade-off here. And if we're over on this left-hand side of the map, we may be able to move much quicker, but you're going to be taking more risks. You're not necessarily going to be understanding what's working well and what's not. And over on the right-hand side, we may lower our risk, but we're going to have to move a little bit slower. And we're going to have to work with partners more carefully and respect the research process to really understand what's working and why. And I think this will also dictate the type of support you're going to need to deliver on your vision. Very, very important, and again, I would overinvest in this part of the process. We certainly did. Sit down and understand what is the ethical approach you want your team to make, what do you want your team to be known for, and certainly not known for. So we spent many hours thinking through this. Our team came up with a short set of ethical imperatives that guide the type of work we do and certainly guide the type of work that we won't do. The Richard Thaler quote that if you should be helping people to get to a decision that they would want to get to if they had full-time attention and ability is certainly a heuristic that our team operates by. But also transparency, maintaining full choice where possible, and the like. So we took this very seriously, and I think another important thing here is to make sure it's very practical and very simple, because you want teams across your organisation to understand the type of work you do, where your boundaries are, and how they should be thinking about applying these insights as well. So this is the conceptual map that we build, and hopefully for corporates out there that are starting to think about building their own behavioural insights team, this might help to get started and to address some of the questions that we had to address. At CBA, as I said, we're very fortunate to launch at a time when the bank was launching their new approach to financial wellbeing. We gained very top-level support very, very quickly. We then decided that we were going to operate both on the production side and the consumption side. So firstly, as Mo mentioned earlier this morning, we launched this vehicle called CBA Mice, which stands for Measurement, Innovation, Collaboration and Evidence. How do we work with community groups? How do we work with researchers to really not just consume evidence, to produce it, understand what works and why for financial wellbeing, and create new behavioural innovations, new behavioural products. You're also always going to get demand for very quick insights to apply very quickly across the organisation, and we certainly continue to get this. So BE Office Hours is a process we launched where staff can come to us, and if it's a safe request that we can address very quickly, sending a reminder, making a letter more simple, we can absolutely meet that demand with BE Office Hours. The third vehicle we set up is to deliver business unit projects. So these are the types of projects that the business units are demanding from us, a bit longer format, but might not necessarily need to meet the rigour of publication that we would get under CBA Mice. And finally, at CBA we have a unit called Biff, which is an internal startup vehicle. So if you have a good innovative idea, perhaps grounded in really rigorous behavioural insights, but it's quite new and there's not a lot of case studies for it around, can we get funding to build a small prototype, test it in a really small scale lab or in a very safe way, and if it's working, how do we safely then scale it up and eventually produce research that we've developed a new behavioural innovation, a new way of thinking about financial wellbeing that we can launch at scale. So these four vehicles are the product of all of those questions that we had to answer very, very carefully in the last 18 to 24 months of work for CBA. So just to close, start with the vision. What do you want your team to do? What do you want to be known for? What are the big problems that you want to solve? And then from there, I would cascade down the types of projects that you want to deliver. Build the right expertise. Are you going to need partners, academic or practitioner? Make sure they share your vision and make sure your team's set up in the right place with the right support. Finally, take careful delivery decisions. Really manage that risk-speed trade-off. Get your ethical approach right and make sure it's well understood across your organisation, what you will do and what you won't do, and work out the engagement model, how a team's going to work with you, giving you the four examples here that we use at CBA. I understand this may not work for everyone. These are the types of decisions that we had to face. We took it very, very seriously. It's taken a long time. I wish I could say it was easy. And we are certainly still on the path. We are still going. So looking forward to sharing more results in another conference soon. Thank you very much.
So it's not easy to come at the end of this panel as all the key success factors have already been mentioned, but I'm going to try to take you backstage on the more murky territories of how the Behavioural Insights very small unit started in France, in Paris. So I'm not going to talk about how to set up a BI team in general, but how to set it up from scratch in very complicated conditions because there was a change in government within the past year and also with very, very little resources. So maybe that's a bit more specific than the previous talks. So just to give you an idea, so basically I'm going to share with you 8 insights or lessons that we've learned so far. And the first one is the most important one, I think, which is having a lot of adaptability to changing environments, because there is no magical recipe. You have to adapt each time to very changing environments, and a lot of enthusiasm and perseverance, as you said earlier. So to give you an idea where everything in terms of BI started in France, so when I first joined the team in 2016, it was mainly located, interest for BIs mainly stemmed from the Prime Minister's services in a specific, here in innovation team, inside something called the General Secretariat for Modernization of Public Action. So basically, this is a Prime Minister's service that's interested in modernizing public action by bringing in new tools like design and innovation, but also digital tools, what you see here. And there was a change in government, and therefore this structure split into 2, and now we're not on a Prime Minister's service anymore, but we're under the authority of the Ministry of Finance, and the whole digital part is now in a different area. So right now we're sitting inside DITP, which is the Interministerial Directory for Public Transformation, and we are inside an innovation team that does design, innovation, and citizen participation, and behavioral insights is a smaller team within that. So DITP is also concerned with modernization of public action, but also helping different ministries deliver their transformation programs. Right now, we're a team of 3 full-time people. So I myself come from a cognitive neuroscience background, where I studied the basics of the neural mechanisms of decision-making, and also post-induced preference change, so cognitive dissonance. We also have someone who is much more on the policy sides and who really understands exactly what government wants and translates this language to us as researchers. As the third person also is a cognitive scientist, but also with a background in statistics and experimentation. And we're going to be joined by 2 extra people in September who have backgrounds more in economics. So this is kind of the composition of the team. So we're a very small team. And I'm going to take you through the story of how everything built up and tell you the different phases that we went through. So I gave them names. Some of them are weird names, so you'll see. So the first phase here was a kind of a trigger phase, where this is before I joined the team, where there was an interest in applying BIs, and it was done with external consultants, one of whom is actually in this room, Eric Singler, and basically with one trigger project, which was done with tax administration. And basically, this project was about how to make people pay their taxes online as opposed to on paper. And it was a very big randomized controlled trial with 2.5 million users, which had very interesting results with 10% increase of people paying their taxes online, and which kind of was the foot in the door into saying that behavioral insights has added value and that there should be more investment in this topic. And basically, there were other topics that were also done with external consultants, but this phase kind of convinced the idea that we should maybe create a small team within government. And this is 2016 when I joined the team, and I'm going to call this phase "doing our best" because it's exactly what happened. So basically, when I arrived, there weren't dedicated resources to behavioral insights, and we kind of had to do everything from scratch with a lot of trial and error, and to see what works or what doesn't. Also, again, to put it in context, there was a government that was going to change, so we kind of had a lot of freedom to do whatever we wanted until the government changed and kind of test different models. So this is also interesting, even though it could sound a bit of a weakness somewhere. So the first thing we did was, as it was mentioned earlier, set up a vision and ethical standards. So this is extremely important because there's a lot of misconceptions of what BIs can be. It can be perceived as small gadgets. Some people may not integrate the fact that you need to do long experimentations on the ground. And so you need to really make it clear what exactly you're doing, whether you're more in an evidence-based policy-making framework or whether it's just small interventions. And we worked a lot on setting up an ethical chart and ethical standards that would be shared by the different partners that we work with. And as I said earlier, given that we're an interministerial structure, this means that our projects are each time done with partners which are different ministries. The second thing we worked on was methodology. And methodology was basically trying to see be inspired actually by the different units that existed and try to see whether the different models of methods that they apply can be done by us. And we also tested different pilot projects. So we tested them at the national level, but also at the local level. And I'll tell you in a bit the difference between these two and what it taught us. Again, because we were very small, we also did something new, which was training public agents. So we worked with, for example, the people from the mairie, I don't know how you say this in English, but basically the town hall. And we trained 15 public agents that we embarked along with us for 6 months. So training them on behavioral insight, on going to the field, collecting data. So they helped us. So we kind of brought in capacity, given that we didn't have that much capacity. And this was actually interesting. And I'll tell you also what we learned from this. And finally, we also worked with public administration schools. So trying to teach or do projects with public administration schools so that the students also can help us in think and deliver some of the projects. So this is kind of doing our best with the very little resources we had and trying to maximize outcome. And the third phase now is the phase where we finally have resources. So this is within the new government where we have sponsorship and support. And finally, we just launched a call for projects and have set up criteria for picking the right topics. So I'm going to talk about this as well. And also, it's a phase where we're going to start collaborating with experts and researchers. So these are the 3 big phases, and we're in phase 3 right now, but I'm going to tell you the insights, the lessons learned from phase 2 and then from phase 3. So the first lesson we learned here in setting up the vision and the mission statement and ethical charts is that it's really, really important that everyone is on the same shared standards. And this is very important because we've had also experiences where the ministry we were working with was expecting something completely different. And as long as not everyone is on the same page, then it's very hard to actually deliver things you can that everyone agrees on. In methodology, one lesson we learned, and this is something that we're going to start implementing now, is that you need to really do your best, even if it's not perfect. So when we first started our initial projects, we were really going for the RCT gold standards and having really rigorous methods. But then we realized that depending on the ministry you're talking about, depending on the availability of data or their maturity in terms of understanding what experiments require, they will not be able to align with these rigorous demands. So I think it's really important in this case that even if it's just doing an Excel sheet with a before-after tiny experiment, you should do it. This is something that we're going to start doing now because I think administrations, especially in France, have a long way to go to get into the whole evidence-based experimentation requirements. And I think that there should be a balance that you should find between the existing resources and scientific rigor. What we learned about during the phases where we piloted projects is that the type of partner you're working with is extremely important. First of all, in terms of engagement, so they should, in a way, show the engagement they have, even if whether it's by putting a small financial contribution or even having offices inside their ministries where you can actually go and work to be. Because proximity is also extremely important, but also can they really change things on the ground, or are you talking with partners who can't actually go and implement the results that you are recommending? So finding the right support is extremely important. And also one thing we learned with the training of agents is that even though it helped us a lot in gathering resources outside of our team, we kind of communicated something which we didn't want, that BI is easy and that you can actually do it yourself. And this risk of creating overconfidence or not explaining that it needs a very specific expertise and that it is also extremely, extremely important. So fighting oversimplification so that it doesn't turn into something where you have listicles of biases that can just be applied with like a magical wand and save problems is very important. So this is something that we're stressing on a lot right now. We're just telling people what BIs are and what can be done with them, but we're also explaining that it's extremely important to have experts on board. So these are the types of projects we worked on, just to give you a very quick overview. But I'm going to quickly go into phase 2, so that I can phase 3, sorry, so that I can finish on time. So in this phase right now, we're not in the trial and error anymore. We learned a lot of things from here, and now we're more working really on actual projects with the right resources. And so in this phase, it's important to put the right criteria and pick the right topics. So in our call for projects, what we're trying to do is kind of nudge administrations to bring out topics that are in line with policy priorities, because if they're not, then the project won't go as fast and it will be harder to implement. But also trying to tackle problems where the behavioral component is extremely important and more than systemic problems. So also this is important because there's a tendency to kind of the word in English is not coming, culpabiliser, to kind of put blame a lot on citizen biases, while the problem is much more systemic and it's not about behavior or citizen bias. Also have ethical standards in picking the topic, and most importantly, the availability of data, because this is something that a struggle that we had in the past. So starting on solid foundations, but also having other facilitating criteria. So for example, picking topics that have shown proven efficiency in other countries. Replication is a good way to start if you really want to have rapid return on investment. Also picking topics that have fast implementation and measure of impact, because right now we're at the phase where we have this funding, but we also still need to show that that there is a return on investment. And also picking topics that engage different types of actors and not only citizens. So for example, the prescription of antibiotics is a good example, where you're targeting doctors and it's not only citizens, but you can also do projects where the targeted population is actually the decision makers themselves. And also picking topics that are also social welfare oriented and not only expense oriented. So these are kind of the criteria that we've been using to pick out the topics. And so these also increase your chances of success in the beginning when you're setting up the team. And finally, collaborating with the right people, with the right experts and researchers, because in our case, we're only 3, and obviously we cannot tackle all policy problems. So we're trying to set up a network of behavioral scientists to have more scientific rigor and also do certain types of lab experimentations before setting out the solutions. And also, right now we have a call for projects where different consultants and experts can respond to the call and help us build our expertise. So the last point is to know your limits and have rigor and also humility. So here's a summary of all the points that I mentioned. And basically, this is what we've been doing so far. Hopefully, with all these lessons learned, we're going to build up a bigger team and be inspired by everyone at BX. Thank you.
There, while I welcome all of the rest of our speakers back on stage to start the conversation portion. Of this session. I have many questions. I sense that many of you in the room might also have many questions. Let me take the facilitator's prerogative and kick off with our speakers. And Tara, I might start with you. And I'm foreshadowing a little bit here our debate in the next session. It's good to see Dilip in the room as well. What was easy that you expected to be difficult? And what was difficult that you expected to be easy?
Great, there's so many to choose from. I'm not sure if this is working. I might fall enough. I'll just talk loud. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, so it all goes back to what Alex said about fit and enthusiasm, and that was one thing I skipped over and didn't mention, and I couldn't agree more with Alex about that. So what went easy that we felt would be really hard? We recruited this really diverse team, like I said, from across consultants and academics and psychologists, and mixed them up with economists. And I really did wonder about how we would bring together such diversity and so quickly, because we accelerated very rapidly in size. and our service offer. And it really does go back to the fit and enthusiasm and the commitment, having a really strong mission and having everyone super on board with that has meant that we've created a really great culture. So that is one thing that I am so proud of at Beta. And it was one thing that I was, we're bringing together people from different tribes with different languages, with different methods. And that happened way easier than I would have ever imagined. And what was difficult that I thought would be easy, again, going to the acceleration of the Beta team from such a small startup through to, we pretty much increased in size by a factor of 10. And I didn't really think it would be too difficult, but too easy, I should say, but we've been through so much change and it has been so accelerated. So if you do get to follow in the footsteps of the Beta team, if you start small and grow rapidly, again, you need that fit and enthusiasm because you need people who are resilient and who are going to say, oh, we're changing that again? Okay, good, let's get on board, let's update our systems because we're much bigger now and we're going to have to do that and we see why we need to do that. So it all comes back, I think, for both of those stories to fit, enthusiasm, resilience, and that's what you need to look for in your people.
I love that. Alex, maybe same question to you. Surprisingly difficult, surprisingly easy?
Probably a lot more in the former category than the latter, I suspect. I think something that I expected to be hard but was actually easy. Probably a lot fewer of those, to be honest with you. I guess going back to the point I made about the media, overcoming the fear of manipulation or Machiavellianism, not uncommon even within government to describe what we do and to be met with a slightly oh my god response of, well, that sounds like you're manipulating people and my expectation would have been that we would struggle a lot to address that concern. Actually, I found it pretty easy, and normally just the very easy solution is just to describe the work we do in practical terms, move it from the abstract to the concrete. And pretty much university, as soon as I do that, move away from what we're applying psychology to behavioral sciences to change people's behaviors, to say, well, what we do is we send people a message, or we do this with them, or we sit down with them and do this with them. Very quickly moves people into kind of saying, oh, well, all that sounds actually eminently sensible and perfectly reasonable things to do. And I guess that's backed up by the work Cass was talking about yesterday. The same happens globally when you move it away from the theoretical to this is what we're trying to do and why. People say, well, of course, that all sounds like perfectly reasonable things to do. There's nothing untoward about that. So that's been a bit easier than I expected. In the other category, difficult but expected easy, probably a lot more things. The one I guess would be interesting to highlight is scaling up successful interventions. In some senses, you might think, well, of course, it's going to be a bit hard, but it's probably been even harder than I expected. You think, well, having gone out, done the work collaboratively, co-designed it with them extensively, evaluated it to the highest level standard possible, and shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that what you're doing is effective and cost-effective, to still then struggle often to get that to be taken up more widely is a source of continuing challenge and frustration at times. Now, of course, there have been, roughly speaking, we've done 20-odd major trials over the last few years and a number of smaller ones as well. About 2/3 of those have been shown to be effective, and we've achieved a positive result, which probably actually suggests we're not taking on enough risk if we're probably getting that higher success rate. And about 2/3 of the successful ones have then been scaled up fully statewide. That still means there are a number that have not been, and it often can be perfectly rational. The effect size can be positive, but it's just too small to be cost effective. But often, even with a large effect size, it's still difficult to overcome institutional barriers, turnover of staff, senior champions, challenges inherent in a distributed system of services in convincing people to adopt something that wasn't invented here.
I like that idea of actually having like the BI team having this role of building your own, but also the government tolerance for risk, that you actually should have like a reasonable rate of interventions that at the trial stage do not succeed. Like that's how you know you're actually pushing the frontiers. Will, how about for you in a very different context where you're simultaneously trying to build a startup more or less inside a big corporation, but also bring to bear a new capability across the business lines?
Yeah, well, something that I thought would be difficult, which turned out to not be, was building excitement across the company. almost to the point where the day I arrived, my very small team at the time was almost crushed by demand and enthusiasm to engage. But then what I thought would be easy, but is certainly not, and I think all the speakers have touched on this, is getting a good, consistent understanding across the organisation of what you are there to do, what you're not there to do, and what behavioural insights is and is not. So you'll get a lot of questions of, can you just do behavioural insights to my thing? And you have to very quickly stand back and say, well, that's not exactly how we're going to do this. And there's been, I think, as across all and we take inspiration clearly from the great work of the behavioural insights teams around the world. We're trying to kind of build that grassroots capability up from the ground and get a good, really good, rigorous, broad understanding of what we're there to do.
Yeah. I sometimes characterize those types of requests as the kind of nudge-ish requests, like, like, can you just make it a bit more behavioural, a bit more human, and actually helping people come on that journey with you of saying, that's actually not quite how it works. Like, there are some general principles that it's helpful for you to be aware of, and one of your roles is kind of disseminating that principled approach across the organisation, but systematically in terms of how people might re-envisage their product and their service offering doesn't work at the nudge-ish level.
I touched on the BE office hours, which we set up in the last 6 months or so, and that has been incredible kind of triage process. So very quickly that catches kind of I'm sorry, we don't need to take this any further, or actually what you're trying to do is very simple and all of the evidence points to it working, so here's a safe way to do it, or let's escalate it up to a more rigorous approach.
But such a pragmatic way as well of kind of managing your own demand, but also introducing yourself to the organisation. And you can envisage a whole range of contexts in which that kind of office hours approach would work, or just simply being available to people. Mariam, same question to you. I loved this moment in the genesis of the organisation where the French election is pending, and so there's this space, like this, semi-chaotic space in which you have lots of license and agency to test things. What was difficult? What was easy about that?
About that specifically, I guess what was difficult was navigating in a lot of uncertainty, definitely. But more generally, what was hard for me in general coming into this field is colliding with coming out of the academic world and the research world and colliding with the policy world, as these two worlds are completely different. I think there are two species, like Homo researcherus and Homo politicus, I don't know. But basically, it's extremely different. The languages they speak are very different. The confidence displayed in what you say is extremely different. A researcher will definitely use many brackets to say, we might know 95%, 0.005. It's like all these uncertainties, while in the policy world, you really have to display a lot of like certainty and confidence that you know exactly what works when I'm not sure you do. So this was very difficult for me, and it still continues to be difficult when we're working, when we're trying to make researchers collaborate with policymakers, because we also have to translate. So I kind of became a mutant, a hybrid of the two species, and I understand now the two languages, but I have to also do a lot of translation and bring people to speak the same language. So this was extremely difficult and continues to be. What's easy, on the other hand, is building enthusiasm with the different partners and explaining to them the relevance of behavioral insights. And I think during this phase of uncertainty, we planted a lot of seeds, and now we have a lot of interest. So with the call for projects, we're having much more projects than expected. So that's pretty exciting and easy.
I think it's one of those lessons that we haven't necessarily made explicit, but is kind of a theme running through the conversation of finding a way to bring into your team those people with that sophisticated knowledge of how you navigate government, both the personalities and the politics and the systems, and how you manage those stakeholders and understand their interests and desires at all level of the organisation, their own tolerances for risk and where the frontiers are. Like sometimes that kind of knowledge of government, knowledge of the theory and behavioural insights, conceptual work is housed in the same person, in the form of someone like David Halpern. But often, as you build the team, you're actually cross-pollinating. That one person on the team is actually teaching the other, and you're building that internal partnership around that. I loved that conversation about reflecting on the easy and difficult pieces. Let's throw it open to the room. Those of you thinking about starting a behavioral insights team, those of you already part of the way on the journey, what questions and lessons can the panel share with you? Elaine, I think we have one here in the front, followed by one more at the back, and then one in the back row. I have seen you. And we'll have a fourth one right here.
Kylie Delling, I'm from WA Treasury. Just building on some of the points that were discussed and trying to take it in context of, I guess, from a selfish point of view of what we're trying to push for in WA. It's kind of a two-part question. Part one is around keeping relevance. So I think, Alex, you mentioned that you were kind of filling a vacuum in terms of that there wasn't necessarily a space with the data and the evaluation side, but in government, obviously, there's a lot of teams that often get put together, whether it be, centres for program evaluation or data analytics centres. So how do we keep the relevance on the work that you're doing and work best within these different government organisations or groups that get running? And secondly, how do you then influence the influencers? So what advice could you give us with regards to selling BI to ministers or heads of agencies to make sure that relevance is kept on the discipline?
Should we start with you?
Sure, why not? So I think the first part of the question about the interrelationship, so we now in New South Wales do have a Centre for Program Evaluation and a Data Analytics Centre and things. I think it's about making sure you have a unique selling point, being clear what it is you do that nobody else does. Actually, that's not too hard with BI, although obviously things like data analytics and evaluation and innovation are all key elements of what we do. The package we put together, I think, we're still able to tell a clear narrative that makes it clearly distinct from what any other innovation or data analytics or program evaluation function might tell you, usually in reference to what other people have done, what we have achieved. Examples, the power of examples really comes down to answer your second part of the question as well, which is overwhelmingly what grabs people's attention, the most senior people, is when you very quickly as possibly move away from the abstract discussion of what BI is and start giving them examples, that, especially ones that speak to them and their interests, right? We found this even within moving between agencies within the New South Wales government. We were able to convince some to move quite quickly, and there are others that's taken us a very long time to get anything agree that there's still that sense of, oh, sure, it works in health and justice, but it won't work in education or it won't work in taxes, wherever it is. When you actually go to them and say, we've shown it can work in your area, we've done something with your team, or even if we can't do it, someone else did it. The Commonwealth did it with their equivalent agency, and this is the result, and here it is, it's there, it's stark, it's a 4 percentage point change. Would you like us to come and do something the same with you? And usually starting fairly small with them, getting a small and relatively quick that you can do in their turf that gets them really excited, and then once you've done it and shown something can work, then they're much more willing to kind of license more complex and more longer-term pieces of work.
Elaine, I think we had a question in the third to last row or so at the back. And while we're just going that question, there's actually a gorgeous piece of prose in the first or second chapter of David Halpin's book, Inside the Nudge Unit, which I commend to those of you on the beginning of this journey. It's really wonderful, about influencing the influencers. And he recounts the story of kind of one of those very early trials for that team of this tax compliance trial, these tax messaging letters that many of you will now be very familiar with, that induce people to pay their taxes on time, and bringing this forward in front of a very skeptical cabinet table, who were immediately brought around by the power of those results. I think there are a few better narratives about influencing the influencers than that book.
I should just say, deploying the right person just reminded me is quite important there. So bringing in someone with a bit of star power never hurts, but make sure you choose the right person. David often talks about bringing in Daniel Kahneman at one point, and so this is fascinating. How can we use it in government? He said, I have no idea. It's just not his style of thinking, right? Get the right. So that didn't help their cause. Yes. But other people, brought in Richard Thaler and so on, who are much more able to kind of say, well, look, this is how we can use it.
Hi, Evan Turner from the Department of the Environment and Energy. I was wondering if you could share any insights about working with stretched line areas. So budget's quite tight, so teams are just running as hard as they can to do BAU, and we come asking them to do more. I was wondering if you have found that just designing a project and going to them with it almost fully done to take the burden off them was effective, or just co-designing was effective.
I mean, in some instances, you might also be asking this stretched agency or this stretched team to find the money to pay for your support as well, which can be really challenging. Mariam, Tara, I feel like you both have this kind of like, building something under constraints experience.
I feel like maybe I'm going to answer one part of the question. I think co-designing is extremely important. It's also like an application of BI Insight, which is that if people feel like they were there from the start and that their ideas were taken in, they'll be more engaged. But this is something that we saw because we did different things where either we co-constructed and designed a trial or an idea with the partners, or we just came in with something developed and presented it to them, and it completely changed when they were really on board from the beginning. So I think what we do now is really, from the start, make sure that the partners are engaged and are on board with us, even though we do show them that there's an expertise that's going to be there and that their added value is telling us all the policy relevant information that they have. This is one part.
And we've done it both ways as well. So early on, we were very client-driven. So people kind of brought us all of their problems, and then there's a huge sifting process to work out what's behavioural, where can we help. We also ran a really big, what we call expression of interest process across the whole of the Australian Public Service in our second phase to say, bring us your best ideas. And again, Mariam talked a bit about a project criteria, so that's always been really important. So agencies really need to understand what that project criteria is, because otherwise you're a little bit at risk of wasting people's time, raising expectations. So you need to bring that marriage of our understanding of behavioural insights and how we can help with the policy expertise. And I think what really works best is finding, when there's stretched resources, is you need to find something that they really, really, really care about. And it really helps if it's something that they have to deliver. So our projects, which we've done in the fastest timescales and to a high quality, have been the ones where the government often has announced something already. They say, we're going to come in, we're going to have superannuation trustees offer a new retirement income plan, and we're going to regulate the product disclosure system around that. It's publicly announced, they have to deliver it. We're able then to make sure Treasury prioritises that, right? Because otherwise the minister's going to be breathing down their neck. And it was also really helpful to say, walk into superannuation funds and say, the government's announced this. You've got an opportunity to work with us to build and test evidence to see what will work, because at the end of the day, that's the regulation you'll be complying with. So I think really finding those spaces that people care about and have to deliver the best and fastest way to go about it.
I love that. And I think for people just starting out, that idea of like, where are the situations where there's been a senior pre-commitment that there will be a solution, like that a solution will be found, and using that as your entry point. Will?
I might just add quickly to the question. Something that's worked for us, working very closely with our academic partners, is maybe if a department can't do a full-blown end-to-end study, is there some historical data where a natural experiment has been created? So price change, product change, policy change, that creates us a natural experiment that we can just pull data and have a look at. Also, instead of just rolling out a product to our 6 million customers, can we negotiate for a staggered rollout? Again, working closely with our partners to get it right, to make sure that we release in cohorts so we can actually learn something about what's happening and go from there. But less, I guess, less intensive.
I love that. How do you use what you have in the form of the potential for natural experiments, and how do you insert yourself into the process in a way that's valuable but not disruptive?
Yeah.
I think we had one in the back row and then one down here.
So I'm Mike Luca from Harvard Business School. First off, thanks for the super interesting presentations. But the quick question I had is trying to get a sense of the role that experiments play in your organizations. Certainly, kind of it's possible to have a behavioral insights team without experiments, and it's possible to run experiments that aren't behavioral. So I'm trying to get a sense of both how many experiments each of your organizations has run and what your framework is for thinking about when to run an experiment and when to say, okay, we have enough of a framework already, we should just kind of implement this, and it's not worth taking the time or investment to do an experiment.
Yes, great questions. One, quantitative. How many experiments have you run, and then how and when, under what conditions do you decide to run one?
I'm not sure. I have to go back and count. I think we've run sort of 20 or so RCTs, and a couple of which, RCTs and a few non-randomized control trials as well, and one or two pre-post test type approaches. I guess when do we try and use them? We try to do it by default, and I guess our position is that we want to be argued back from that as a sort of starting point. Even stuff that is apparently quite rigorous and very sensible, we know doesn't always translate across to other areas. We did some work around taxes and fines around fine payment, and we tried to then apply almost identical approach to payment of another tax, land tax, and it didn't work at all. That's experience has been experienced by many other teams worldwide. Fundamentally it's a different cohort, even though the issue is the same. Do you pay your tax on time? They are a different group of people experiencing different demands and pressures, and I can't honestly say I would ever say, nah, don't bother running an experiment, there's no point. Now, there may be occasions where you just don't choose to because it's just not practical, but I would almost never say there's no point running it. You can always learn something new or always continue to advance the knowledge. But yeah, there are some trade-offs around that, how can we actually measure it effectively? Can we collect the data? Can we randomise? Is it ethical to randomise? Certainly in New South Wales government, the dominant user of RCTs is the Department of our Ministry of Health, obviously mostly in the clinical kind of domain, and outside of them, we're probably the only organisation actually running RCTs. Might be one or two tucked away in other parts of the government I'm not aware of, probably are, but predominantly it's us and in the health domain.
A bit like Alex's team, we like to experiment by default. Sometimes we find constraints around that, so whether it be data collection systems, timescales in policy, but that's our starting point, and that's because it's part of our mission to drive experimentation across government. And it goes to a question that was raised earlier about what our niche is, or differentiation point with other behavioural insights teams across the public service is there are a couple of other teams that are running randomised control trials, but that's certainly where I see our point of difference. We pre-register, we publish by default, and we're the biggest team with a trial design team now of around 6 or 7 people, which is probably bigger than most other behavioural insights teams around the public service. So, but we also need to look at costs and benefits, right? So the trial, I flashed up a chart really quickly to show you, was where we sent a text message to job seekers who receive financial assistance from the government. And what we find is that around 80,000 people in any given fortnight don't do a simple task, which is to report their employment income. And when they fail to do that, their payment is delayed, and if they wait long enough, they have their payment cancelled entirely. So we got great results there. We increased on-time reporting by 13.5 percentage points. That's the kind of intervention where I think we're starting to look now and say, right, this should just be scaled. We need to think, we need to be practical, we need to think about costs and benefits. What are the risks of this backfiring? What's the harm going to be? But take our AMR trial, for example, with GPs. No, we probably wouldn't be suggesting that we translate that into a range of different contexts. Yep. So a long answer, but you know, each problem you need to do the analysis and consider it and have it in context. There's no easy answer.
But both working back from this experiment by default, RCTs, is not just the kind of gold standard, but really the kind of assumed. To help Mike with his data gathering exercise, how many experiments? I know you have these 9 trial reports.
Yes, sorry Mike, and hello, thanks for coming to Australia. We have published 9 reports now, but we have a whole stack of RCTs in the field. We're somewhere between 20 and 30 at the moment, and we're continuously going through a business development phase and launching trials. So we're hoping to really get a lot more out there.
Yeah, I might just start by saying I think in the private sector, the word experimentation sometimes gets stretched a little bit. So I got 10 people in a room and 8 of them really liked my product, so it's got an 80% confidence rate. So we wanted to make, everything we're doing as we build the team, we wanted to make ourselves really accessible, and the reasons and justifications really accessible. We talk about, I guess, 3 tiers of experimentation being actionable, reportable, and publishable. And very quickly the business can say, well, this is pretty safe, it's pretty small scale. Can you help me get an actionable answer as to how confident we can be, right through to let's run a full-blown multi-year, multi-arm trial with academic partners, and we want to publish. Mo made the point earlier today, and I reiterated, the bank wants to be a producer of science, not just a consumer. So, and they're taking that very seriously from the top down. So I guess trying to put our arms around this word experimentation a little bit for corporates and come up with a accessible, systematic approach to what best suits which situation.
And I think sometimes that word has negative connotations in the corporate sector that are different from some of the connotations that attaches to it in the public sector as well. But pilot testing, A/B testing, trials are much more some people are much more favorably disposed towards that. Mariam?
So in our case, we're a bit behind in terms of experimentation, and even though we did do 10 projects, there's only 1 RCT, but I hear it's one of the largest, so it's 2.5 million users, so I guess maybe it compensates. I'm joking, but basically on the other projects, so 2 of our projects, we stopped at the phase of implementing the solution, and then 2 researchers got on board and now have students working with the relevant ministries that are doing the RCT, so they're ongoing. And for the rest of the projects, it was really at the end of the mandate of the government, so they're kind of aborted. I mean, there's experimental data to see how people perceive the interventions, but there isn't any experimentation per se. Which is why in the criteria that we set now for our call for projects, the part on experimentation and data is extremely strict and explicit. So we're really hoping it's going to set the standards for more experimentation in the coming years.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to call a pause there, I believe, because we're now standing between you and lunch. But I hope if one thing is clear from today, you have a panel here that's both deeply sophisticated and thoughtful about how you build this capability, but also passionate about doing it. So if I might make this offer on behalf of them, I sense that for those of you who still have questions, this is an approachable group who will be ready to share over the rest of the conference. Right at the beginning, we talked about how do you have the right leadership and supporting environment? Are you really clear about your operating model? And have you got the right capabilities and partners in place? And I think over the course of the 90 minutes, so there are so many different permutations to how those things can be in place and how you construct them, but making sure that as a team, you're both clear and explicit about those is what really sets you up for success. This was one of the sessions I was most excited about. Panelists, it did not disappoint. Can you please join me in thanking our panelists on how to set up a BI team?